Episode 9, Waiting for Me to Die. The content of this podcast is based on my personal experiences, my own interpretations, and the information that I have been told or discovered for myself. These accounts reflect my perspective and understanding of events as I lived them. Everyone mentioned is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Nothing shared here should be taken as a legal judgment, a definitive statement of fact, or a formal accusation. This podcast is intended for storytelling and documentation of my journey, and while I strive for accuracy, listeners should understand that these are my views and recollections. Something really important I failed to mention back in episode 8 happened on June 23rd, 2021. Pa fell and injured his hand. The fall wasn't minor. He actually broke a rib and fractured his finger. Darren and Melissa arranged for an ambulance to take Chet to the emergency room. I rushed over to be with him, but Melissa and Darren never showed up. Instead, they stayed with Lois at her house. While I was sitting in that hospital, I had to be the one to reach out to Darren with updates on Pa's condition. Darren only asked me one thing, and it stuck with me. He said, quote, "I know this might be difficult to assess, but would you think they'll need round-the-clock care for the next several nights? Would Chet be able to turn Lois, handle a bedpan, etc.? I would think not, with the hand and rib injuries." End quote. On the surface, that might sound like a reasonable question, but knowing the bigger picture, it carried a much heavier weight. He quickly added that they were already working to secure additional help, which I couldn't help but see it as yet another push towards having Chet and Lois move in with them. Several hours later, I finally got Chet home from the emergency room. Darren and Melissa were still there. That moment was awkward, but I reminded myself, I was there for Pa, not for them. I walked up the hallway to visit my grandma, but Darren lingered in the doorway, close enough that it was obvious that he was listening in. Lois, whose voice was already soft and frail, tried to lower it even more. She confided in me that at one point, she had actually asked a family member to call Adult Protective Services for her, not because of me, but because of all the things that she was being told. She said eventually she saw it for herself that I was not the problem. But then her tone shifted. She told me that she had always wanted to help us buy a home, and she apologized that things had become so twisted. Then she asked me directly to protect Chet, financially, physically, and spiritually, from Darren. She described him as quick to anger and said that she had finally seen his true colors. She also admitted that she worried about Melissa, but she didn't say why. She couldn't, because Darren was right there, hovering, making sure she couldn't share as much as she wanted to. Jumping back into our timeline, we arrive at March 26, 2022. That's when Chet and Lois finally made a big decision. They asked my father, Ed, to step in as their trustee and remove Darren and Melissa from all of the documents. What's crazy is that even then, they still hadn't received the trust yet, so they don't even know what to work with. But Chet explained that he knew what he wanted the documents to say, but feared what was written didn't truly reflect his wishes. Ever since Mark and Scott had passed away, he had wanted to make changes to the trust anyway, to ensure things were handled the way he felt was right. Lois was the most adamant. She insisted that she wanted Ed to take over. She felt betrayed, angry, and deeply worried. Around that time, Lois mentioned something unusual. She had told me that a notary had come to their house and claimed that they had been sent there by me, supposedly to fix something related to my house. But I never sent anyone. Later, we found out that it really was tied to my house, but Darren was the one who had sent them. More on that soon. Then came April 4th through April 19th. My mom, dad, sister Tiffany, and her kids went on a cruise to Hawaii. This trip had been planned well over a year earlier, long before any of these issues began. We jokingly called it the COVID cruise. One entire floor of the ship was quarantined for passengers who had tested positive. After returning home, they were required to quarantine for 10 days. My mom and dad tested negative, but Tiffany and her kids weren't so lucky. They tested positive. So, why does this matter? Because during that entire time, my parents weren't reachable by phone. They weren't dodging calls, their phones simply didn't work while they were at sea. And when they did return, the quarantine period kept them away from my grandparents even longer. Sadly, that meant even more time passed where Chet and Lois were left to deal with everything on their own. And then, the very day my parents docked in Long Beach, they checked their phones. Waiting for them were voicemails from Chet and Lois, messages filled with fear and desperation. They were terrified about what might happen if my dad didn't make the changes to the trust soon. On April 19th, 2022, the same day my parents' boat docked, the sheriff showed up at Chet and Lois's house. The visit was about something serious, the money that Melissa had been taking out of their Westcom credit union accounts. Chet handed the deputy the bank statements covering September 30th, 2021 through January 12th, 2022. The statements told the story plain and simple. Melissa had withdrawn $10,000, then $20,000, then $50,000, and another $50,000. A total of $130,000 was taken. The deputy ended up calling Melissa directly. She admitted to taking the money. She told the deputy that she would pay it back, except for the $20,000 she claimed was a gift for her acne scar. Under pressure from the sheriff's department, Melissa transferred $110,000 back to Lois. But that wasn't the only discovery. In the mail, Chet also got his trust back, and it was nothing like what he had expected. The first red flag, the home that Chet and Lois were still living in, was written to the trust to be transferred to Melissa's daughter, outright and free of the trust, on her 25th birthday, even though Chet and Lois were alive and still living there. And if Amanda didn't want the house, it would pass to Melissa. As they looked deeper, it only got worse. Nearly everything Chet and Lois owned was set up to funnel back to Darren and Melissa in one way or another. They had even inserted clauses to grab the shares of my Aunt Wendy's house, and even the share of my own house that Chet and Lois still owned. All of it, so they could bankroll the mansion Darren and Melissa were already siphoning money for. Chet and Lois panicked. It confirmed what they had feared. Darren and Melissa weren't helping out of kindness, or because they were family. They were helping because they stood to benefit from it, whether Chet and Lois knew it or not. And that raised another question. Trusts have to be notarized, but Chet and Lois had never seen these trusts, so how had they been notarized? The answer? Darren had his own employees from Westcom Credit Union go to Chet and Lois's house to sign off on them. One was even a branch manager who came out on a Saturday afternoon. Think about that. Why would a credit union branch manager supposedly meet with his CEO and Chet and Lois at Chet and Lois's house on a Saturday afternoon to notarize documents? The truth is, the notarization wasn't even done correctly, or legally for that matter. I know that because I've been a notary for almost 12 years. And remember that mysterious notary Lois mentioned before? The one who claimed they were there to fix something for my house? That wasn't about fixing anything at all. It was about placing Chet and Lois's share of my house into the trust that Darren helped create. Another one of the documents made Darren co-trustee of Chet and Lois's trust, giving him virtually the same power and authority that they had, a move that would have ultimately given Darren the power to force me to sell my house and take the profit for himself. And knowing Darren, I have no doubt that he would have done it. That very same day, April 19th, 2022, Chet called my parents frantically while they were still on their way home from that cruise. His voice carried the weight of everything he had just uncovered. He pleaded with them about the urgency of removing Darren and Melissa from the trust immediately. And then Lois leaned into the phone, her voice weak but determined, and said the words that still haunt us. "Please do it fast. They are waiting for me to die." On May 11th, after finally being cleared from the COVID cruise quarantine, my parents, Ed and Kathy, went over to meet Chet and Lois to discuss the trust. They spent several hours at the house, poring over the pages, reviewing what had been done, and realizing what an outright disaster the trust had been turned into. Ed told them bluntly that this was too complex to patch. It needed to be rebuilt by an attorney. The new trust wasn't going to be perfect right away, but at Chet's command, he had some non-negotiables. Darren and Melissa were to be removed. Ed was to take Darren's place as trustee, and Ed had to do it himself, and he had to do it now. 2 days later, on May 13th, Ed and Kathy found a traveling notary to meet at Chet and Lois's house and notarize the trust. Then, on May 15th, Westcom Credit Union was given the updated documents to ensure the legal department received them and to prevent Darren and Melissa from making any more changes or withdrawals. What we didn't know at the time was that the paperwork we gave to Westcom we actually handed right back to the branch manager, who was the very same notary that Darren had once brought to Chet and Lois's home to notarize his version of the trust. Just days later, from May 19th through May 22nd, I flew to Cancun for a work event. Anna came with me while the kids stayed at home with my parents. I was already nervous. Grammy's health was declining, and I was terrified she might pass while I was stuck in Mexico. COVID protocols were also still very strict, and the thought of being stranded in another country haunted me. After only one night there, we got the news. Someone in our work group had tested positive for COVID. Not just anyone, someone I'd sat with multiple times. We were told to quarantine immediately, possibly for 14 days. 14 days stuck in a hotel room in a foreign country, away from my kids, while my wife was furious and my parents had to cover longer than expected. Even worse, when we went to be tested, the man administering the test whispered that for $28, he could make sure we passed. We tested negative anyway, thankfully, but the entire ordeal was surreal. An experience I'll never forget, though I wish I could sometimes. In the end, we made it home without incident. But when we got back on May 23rd, we found out that Lois is not doing well. She was still alive, but she could no longer speak. Just a week later, on May 30th, 2022, Grammy died. I dreaded that call. It brought me to my knees. I poured a few shots just to steady myself. Death had always scared me, ever since I was little. I hated cemeteries, coffins, the finality of it all. Lois had lived with multiple sclerosis, so I'd watched her cycle between walking, leaning on a cane, and using a wheelchair. I loved my Grammy, but I hated seeing her weaken, even though she always fought it, and she always had a great sense of humor about it. She knew cemeteries scared me, so she did what any mischievous grandmother might. She took me to every cemetery between California and New York, the creepiest ones too. Old graveyards, underground mausoleums. I must have seen tens of thousands of graves. She even took me to JFK's Eternal Flame. It was her version of immersion therapy. It wasn't mean, but it was her way of toughening me up. Maybe it was a little mean, but that was her. On the day she died, something strange happened. Darren and Melissa were on their way to Chet and Lois's house, but they were taking much longer than they should have. Lois had them on her Find My app, so I pulled it up. Their location showed them sitting at what appeared to be an attorney's office. I walked over to show my mom, and suddenly, both Darren and Melissa stopped sharing their location with Lois. Just like that. To me, it was another sign, or proof, that they had been listening in, dropping in through the Alexas, or hiding something. Either way, why stop sharing suddenly in that moment? When they finally arrived, they went up the hall to see Grammy before her body was taken away. I still hated being near death, but this was my Grammy. I forced myself to go in. I talked to her, cracked a few jokes she would have loved, hugged her. Then Melissa came in and slipped Lois's engagement ring on her finger, the same ring that she had always claimed she didn't have. Grammy had been asking for it, wanting to wear it one final time. Melissa had claimed others had taken it, my mom, Wendy, but that was a lie. She had it all along. Before all this, and shortly after I got to their house, Chet had pulled me aside. He told me he couldn't bear to watch the funeral home take Lois's body away. He asked me to move him to another room when the time came. So after I was done visiting Lois, and I was walking out of her room, I looked down the hallway and saw the gurney coming through the front door, body bag and all. I moved quickly. "Oh, hell no," I said, and went to stop them. I told them to wait outside until I could get Chet out of the hallway, but before I could, Darren suddenly came out of Chet and Lois's office, looking guilty, like he had been caught doing something. Melissa was right behind him. Darren got in my face. He told me I'd been belligerent all night, that I was yelling and swearing, and I needed to quit acting like a fool. Total garbage. Yes, I'd had a drink earlier, but I was steady, capable, and in total control. He was trying to stop me from helping my family. I told him to move, and I moved past him to get Chet up the hall. I got Chet into another room, just like he asked, and when I came back out, I confronted Darren. I walked up to him and asked, "What is your problem with me trying to help my family?" That's when he snapped. Darren grabbed me by the shirt and yanked me in aggressively. I could have destroyed him right then. In fact, I think Darren was counting on it, but I didn't. Instead, I looked to my dad and said, "Can you get this guy off me?" Right there in that moment, the funeral home director, a firefighter, and my dad were all witnesses to Darren's aggression, the same quick temper Lois had warned me about. My dad and the firefighter pulled him off, but I stood my ground. Darren knew that he had made a mistake. I wanted him in handcuffs. I wanted him in jail, but Chet asked me to not press charges, hoping somehow for family harmony. For Pa, I respected that. I even tried one more time to talk to Darren privately before they left, but he couldn't even make eye contact. When they left, Melissa started taking things off the walls to remember her mom. Like my grandfather didn't still live there. It was sickening. It felt like she had already thought the house and everything in it was hers. But maybe she hadn't heard yet. Next time on the Spencer Files, the fallout from Lois's death shakes the entire family. While Chet grieves the loss of his wife, he also faces the crushing reality of betrayal written into the very documents that were supposed to protect him. When Melissa and Darren find out that my dad, Ed, has been named the new trustee, they are furious, and their response is to sue my parents over the new trust. The very trust that Lois and Chet themselves asked for. But that decision backfires, opening the door for us to finally uncover what Melissa and Darren had really been doing with Chet and Lois's money years earlier, long before anyone realized. And while the family prepared for Lois's funeral, Darren had other priorities. He actually had a scheduling conflict with the dates because he was busy attending a meeting to try to get Melissa on the Real Housewives of Orange County. My father, now as trustee, works to set things right, but every step forward only exposes more of what Darren and Melissa had been plotting. From suspicious legal maneuvers to shocking financial discoveries, the truth becomes harder to ignore. And as tensions boil over, the question becomes unavoidable. How far will Darren and Melissa go to get what they want? And how far will we have to go to stop them?